Hi, I'm James,
And I'm Anthony.
and this is Words and Numbers. How you doing this week, Ant?
James, I'm perplexed.
Perplexed?
The Congress, we hit the debt ceiling. Well, we hit the debt ceiling back in March, but Congress has apparently just come to an agreement with the White House, and they're going to be raising the debt ceiling any day now.
All right, hold the phone, because I could have sworn that last March, Donald Trump, as candidate for the presidency, said that he was going to eliminate the federal debt in 8 years.
Yeah, do you know what would be required to eliminate the debt in 8 years? It would be something like tripling taxes on everybody in sight and then, cutting spending by 50%. That's kind of like the magnitude that you're talking to pull that off.
Yeah, that's right. And we're going to get a little later on today into what it would take simply to balance the budget, which is far less optimistic than paying off the debt. But let's let that sleeping dog lie for the moment. And let's get back to Donald Trump and the United States Congress. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't this going to be the 80th time that we've increased the debt ceiling?
Oh, 80th time since what, the 60s or 70s, thereabouts? I mean, it happens on average like once every 6 months.
Yeah, it's the 80th time since 1960.
Yeah.
And that, I think, tells you really all you need to know when you start thinking about the debt and how much money we're spending.
Yeah, so what's kind of odd, I guess, from the political standpoint is Trump came to agreement with the Democrats, I guess, to pull this off. There's a lot of pushback from the Republicans, but all of it is, in my opinion, is theater, because the fact is they've got to first off, they have to raise the debt ceiling because the government just simply can't function if it doesn't keep spending, and it's not going to be able to spend if they don't raise the debt ceiling. But the thing that perplexes me is the debt ceiling is supposed to be, well, what it sounds like, a ceiling that you can borrow up to that amount and you can't borrow any more. So it's kind of like the limit on your credit card, except that Congress controls the ceiling. So it's more like you having a limit on your credit card, but you get to say what the limit is.
Right, but correct me if I'm wrong, from mid-March of this year until, round about yesterday, the federal debt is held pretty steady at $19.8 trillion, which means, and can only mean, that we haven't borrowed any more money because of the debt ceiling.
And that's the perplexing thing. So if you look at a picture of the debt over time, of course, it's rising. And right about March of this year, it flatlines, and it's just flat from March up until yesterday. And of course, that's us hitting the debt ceiling. But if you look back through recent history, this has happened at least 3 other times that we've hit the ceiling and the debt has flatlined for a matter of months. And what's interesting is that immediately after, in each of those cases, immediately after when Congress has raised the debt ceiling, the debt has jumped a gargantuan amount. In fact, it's as if during this period where supposedly you're at the ceiling, you can't borrow anymore, the government's been borrowing anyway, but the borrowing has been happening off the books somewhere, so that when Congress raises a ceiling, all of this pent-up borrowing dumps onto the debt all at one time. So at the end, if you look at the numbers, it seems that the debt ceiling is even more of a theatrical fiction than what I had thought originally.
Yeah, and oddly enough, we can actually give you the dates and the amounts from the past when this has happened, right?
Right.
So let's just take a quick look at those. The first time that we've got some evidence is from March through August of 2011. And then we've got May to mid-October 2013 and February to November of 2015. Now, what happened during those 3 periods after the flat line?
Well, at the end of the 2011 flat line, so around about August, the August 2011 Congress raises the debt ceiling, and within 24 hours, the federal debt jumps almost 2%. That's a 2% in one day. That's more than 40 times the average daily growth in the debt prior to hitting the ceiling. And you think, well, that's astounding. But then again, in 2013, it happens again. We hit the debt ceiling, and we're flatlining the debt from whatever it was, something through to October. In October 2013, the Congress raises the debt ceiling, and again, within 24 hours, the debt jumps 2%. And then again, this happens in 2015, November 2015. The debt had been flatlined because we hit the ceiling. November 2015, the Congress raises the debt ceiling, and over the course of 48 hours, the debt jumps over 2%, and that increase in the debt was 130 times the average daily growth in the debt prior to hitting the ceiling. And what that tells me is the government was borrowing all along. It just wasn't showing the borrowing on their official figures. Now, what was actually happening in the background, I don't know, right? I don't know the accounting chicanery that's going on. But what I do know is that the government was spending this money anyway, despite the fact they hit the ceiling, and then the whole thing just gets dumped onto the Treasury books at the time that the ceiling gets raised.
Yeah, so we can actually know a few things, and we're probably never going to know a few other things here. But one of the things that we can know, I think with relative certainty, is that the minute we increase the debt limit again, this is exactly what's going to happen. It may not happen the first day, it may not happen the second day, but it's going to happen very, very quickly after we raise the debt limit.
I'll be bold here because this episode of our podcast is going to come out right about the time that the increase in the debt ceiling takes effect. So my prediction is we're going to see when the increase in debt ceiling takes effect, within 24 hours, an increase in the federal debt of around $400 billion, all within about 24 hours. That's my prediction.
Sure, and if the math is relatively similar to what has happened in the past, then $400 billion in a day, that's about what we can expect to happen. I can't really pretend to be surprised that politicians are going to lie about this. They lie about everything else. Why wouldn't they lie about the most important thing, too?
Yeah, well, I guess the thing that's surprising here is we know that they're lying about things and stretching truth and whatnot, but I didn't realize the extent to which that was happening. To my mind, what was going on is it was the debt ceiling theater of we pretend that there's actually a limit on us when there isn't, and Congress just raises the limit whenever it wants to, right? I had no idea this other thing was going on in the background. That in fact, the ceiling itself, more than it being, in the hands of Congress, they can do whatever they want, it appears not to have any meaning even when we hit it.
Right, and this is simply what's going to happen when a rulemaking body imposes rules upon itself. When those rules become uncomfortable, they will just rewrite the rules to make them more agreeable from their perspective. And when it comes right down to it, I suspect the only thing that will ever be able to rein in federal spending would be some sort of constitutional amendment which utterly required a balanced budget, and on and on and on, but with some teeth, right, with some penalty if it wasn't achieved, this sort of thing.
Well, I would think so. Up until our discovery of this business with the debt ceiling, I wonder, is it possible to write a constitutional amendment that's tight enough that Congress isn't going to find some way, behind the scenes to effectively do what it wants to do anyway, regardless?
Or if, 10, 20 years down the road, a Supreme Court read the plain text of the amendment in question and declared that it meant exactly the opposite of what it said.
Right, yeah, that's a super...
This is always the problem with these sorts of things. But in the grand scheme of things, it's hard to imagine anything else bringing enough force of law that would require the rulemaking body to follow it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
That's just about where we stand right now, and Ant and I are relatively agnostic on what a constitutional amendment would have to look like, simply because we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I suspect we're going to in the years to come.
Well, you would hope so, except that you reach a point where where the federal debt gets bad enough that it's not clear that even if you had a constitutional amendment, it would be mathematically possible to follow it, right? So you get to a point where you just owe so much money that either you have to keep borrowing to pay your interest payments, or you default.
Right. And here's where a lot of people get confused. Because, we throw a lot of words around debt and deficit and things like this. And the simple difference between the federal deficit and the United States debt is probably the good place to begin.
So I guess the easy way to think of it is think of the federal debt as the balance on your credit card. And think of the deficit as the amount you add on to your credit card. So every time you charge something, that's like the deficit. So it's to say, as President Trump did, some months ago, that he would have eliminated the $20 trillion debt. That's not the deficit. And in fact, we haven't had a president since Eisenhower who actually managed to get rid of the deficit. The debt itself is way worse than that. This is the sum total of all the deficits that we've incurred since the beginning of the country.
Right. So politically and economically, we've got two different animals here, one of which, the deficit, much easier to address than the debt, although not easy to address at all.
Right.
And, as you said earlier, since Eisenhower, we haven't had a balanced budget. Now, some people claim that Bill Clinton offered up a balanced budget during his time as president, but that's just simply not true.
Yeah, and it's interesting there because this is again another instance of the accounting chicanery that goes on during the Clinton years. And to give Clinton his due, he came closer than any other modern president to balancing the budget. But the only reason that it appears, depending on what books you look at, that he balanced the budget is because in his administration, they reclassified borrowings from Social Security as tax revenue, which would be like you saying, I'm going to take a cash advance off my credit card and call that income. It's the same kind of thing.
The only way that can be revenue is if the federal government has no intention of ever paying it back.
Right, and that opens up a whole new can of worms, right? Because we talk about the amount that the federal government has borrowed from the Social Security Trust Fund, and there are some people, thankfully fewer of them as time goes by, but there are some people who say, well, you really shouldn't count the money the government borrows from Social Security because that's money the government owes itself. And that's completely false. Well, let me back off on that statement. That's false if you believe that the money in the trust fund belongs to retirees. It's perfectly true if you believe that the money actually belongs to the government, in which case the retirees aren't entitled to anything.
All right, so setting aside the thorny Social Security issue, we're back to deficit and debt. And Trump says that he can cure the debt in 8 years. Incidentally, his own budget director says there's no way that can ever happen.
Oh, no, it is mathematically impossible.
That's right. The people who work for the president know better than the president does in this respect. And, let's also probably admit that this was a campaign promise and he never had any intention of following through on it.
No, but the fact that he believed that he could say it with a straight face and people would take him seriously scares me as to what the average voter is aware of.
Well, let's help the average voter out here a little bit, right? Because if we've decided that the deficit is much easier to address than the debt itself, what would it take to get us to balance on the budget? Meaning to say, what would it take for us to have a budget that no longer added any more to the debt?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and that actually you can think of a plausible though painful way to do it in about 5 or 6 years. And that is, you cut all federal spending by 10%. And when I say cut by 10%, I mean the way a real human being would mean cut 10%. You spend 10% less. The interesting thing here is when politicians say cut the budget, what they mean is increase it by less than what they'd like to increase it, right? So you'll hear these things about, we came to an agreement to cut $2 billion from the budget, and the budget gets larger. Well, why does it get larger? Because actually they wanted to get even $2 billion bigger than what it actually did. So you cut in the sense that a real person means cut 10% from the budget. and then hold it constant for the next 5 years. And as you're holding it constant, the economy's growing. And at the end of the 5 years, the economy is now large enough to support the size of government spending that you have, and you'll have at the end of this fifth or sixth year your first balanced budget. And from that point on, you can increase government spending, just don't increase it faster than the economy grows.
Right. It would have to increase to the same degree or less than the economy increases year over year. And if we did that, assuming a relatively even rate of increase, right? So if the budget increased relative to the economy year after year after year, about how many years would we have to go before we actually paid off the debt that we now have?
Yeah, so the thing is, you actually never get to the point of paying off the debt. Rather, you would get to the point of the economy and the federal tax revenues becoming so large that the debt, while you haven't gotten rid of it, has become less meaningful. Kind of like a college student graduates college with, let's say, $80,000 in debt, and that's a huge amount. But 10 years down the road, he's earning some good money, and that same $80,000 debt is not as onerous, right? It's more manageable. But nonetheless, to get to the point that current $20 trillion debt becomes manageable, my guess is you're probably talking, and this is not an exaggeration, you're probably talking about 100 years.
Right. So think about that for a second. In order to correct the problem that we now have, our solution would A, inflict a good deal of pain in the short term, a moderate deal of pain in the intermediate term, and would actually take roughly 100 years to bear fruit.
Right. And I suggest that that's not an exaggeration, largely because it's taken us about 100 years to get to this point. Right? $20 trillion of debt is a tremendous amount of debt. You don't generate that over the course of 1 or 2 decades.
Right, but what we end up seeing is not a willingness on the part of our elected officials to deal with this problem, but more the inclination to keep kicking it down the road in the form of increasing the debt ceiling, right? This is why we talk about increasing the debt ceiling. It's in order to create a situation in which the current elected leaders can be more irresponsible than they were yesterday.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing here is the elected leaders are behaving rationally, right? Each of them is thinking to themselves, well, look, I'm going to be in office for whatever, 15 years. As long as I can survive 15 years in office, that's fine. And the fact is, the magnitude of the problem up till this point has been, although large, small enough that it could be kicked 15 years down the road. But we're now reaching the point where it really can't be kicked that much further. I think we might have another 15 years, but that's it.
Right, and this is the case for a very specific mathematical reason, right? We're not going to be able to pay the interest on the debt with the income the government achieves.
Right. The laws of mathematics start to trump the laws of politics.
Right, and what happens when that comes to pass?
Well, when that comes to pass, you reach a point where, quite literally, the federal government is bankrupt. Now, nobody's going to say that, right? What'll happen is they'll start to do things like expand the money supply. We're going to have to endure inflation. They'll be paying off with the debt with inflated dollars, this kind of thing. But at the end, you get even if you don't have bankruptcy in name, you have all the consequences of bankruptcy in reality.
Right. So what ends up happening is the United States economy looks not unlike the post-war economies of Germany and Italy, right, where money isn't really worth anything, government obligations don't really have any teeth, and, the government exists, but to what effect?
Yeah, I think it's yes and no. It's somewhat like that. There is an important difference. And the post-war economies suffered from an additional problem, which is the infrastructure was destroyed. And when our federal government goes bankrupt, it's all of the infrastructure remains. We still have the physical plant, we still have the businesses, we still have the educated populace, the workforce, all that stuff is still in play. In one sense, the only thing that happened is on the financial books, we're zeroing out debt. But the important thing is that zeroing out of the debt with bankruptcy impacts people's plans. So you had retirees who had planned on receiving Social Security benefits, or you had, the poor who were planning on receiving support from the government. And all those things that people had planned on, they don't happen. And now people have to radically adjust their behaviors.
So as usual, right now, we've got the choice to make collectively as a people between short and medium-term pain or long-term catastrophe. And if what the government is up to right now is any indication, we are actively choosing long-term catastrophe. And I'll throw it to you for the last word, Ian.
Well, I think people often, you and I separately and together had talked about this with a variety of audiences, and people always end with asking, well, what can you do about this? And it sounds trite, but I think it's the right answer. The best thing you can do is help people to understand what this reality is, because the more aware voters are of what the reality is of the government's finances, the more pressure they'll be able to put on our elected officials to actually do something meaningful, and beyond all this smoke and mirrors business that they're currently doing.
And on that happy note, that's all we've got time for this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next Wednesday around about noon Eastern Time for another episode. Until then, check out all the great content at fee.org and at Fee Online on social media. And don't forget to click subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to. I guess we're on all of them at this point. Maybe we can come up with something a little more uplifting for next week, but until then...
Right, we'll try and be happier next week, James.
Until then, I'll see you next week.
See you next week, James.